Good morning. Hemshech Ayin Beis. So we are on page 1238. I'm sorry. What am I talking? 1248. 1248. And we started the new paragraph. So let's resume from there. And just to sum up, it's clear now that the Rebbe Rashab is tying together the knots of that which has been discussed in the last 10 pages and even more, looks to me, even in the last, actually 11 pages. But let's do this step by step. So the first thing is, just for the flow, to keep organized and not get overwhelmed here. So yesterday I went over the structure here that the Rebbe Rashab went through. So let me just go over that because it's critical when we're concluding so-called part of the subject matter. It's good to just go over the main headlines, so to speak, of these, since they're not really chapters or even discourses. So let's just create what is the structural elements here. So I'm not going to go all the way back to Gan Eden, which is where the whole subject began. After that, went into actually I will begin. So Gan Eden is left open with a bunch of questions of what exactly Gan Eden is. We know that there's a Gan Eden that was created, like we learned this past week. In Bereshis, the Gan Eden was created even without any avodah. But we also know Gan Eden increases, the divine revelation Gan Eden is increased through our avodah, which we call schar, the reward, or the result and the effect of our work. So that's something that we talked about a long time ago back on page, might as well, since I'm doing this, I might as well do it completely. Back to page, bottom of page 1220. That's where the discussion began. To understand Gan Eden, Rebbe Rashab is going to go into understanding the three stages of the maturity and development of emotions, what he called mudfa, murgish, and muskel. That's called behavioral, emotional, and cognitive. And that began a long discussion that there's these three stages, and each stage itself has several stages within them. And then on page 1225, he said, Hadugma mekolzeh, this whole discussion about the structure, about the development and growth and maturation of the cognitive and emotional faculties of a person is a dugma b'neshama elokis. So I'm just pointing out the main, what shall we say, the junctures. We'll call it the main junctures of how the structure of this whole section is develops. So he says, dugma is the neshama elokis. That too has three levels of how the divine soul also grows and matures within a person. Because remember, a divine soul, even of a tzaddik, is a child, is not as it is in a full-blown adult. So he goes through that all this is an avodah, and again, the levels of behavioral ava v'yira, and then emotional ava v'yira, and then cognitive ava v'yira, and again, all the different levels within the three. Okay. And I'm not going to go now through those levels themselves. That we've done many times, and we can always do it again. I really want to just do this intentionally for where we are now, just to show that connection and flow. Okay. Now, once he discussed those levels, so now in the highest level, he went the Rebbe Rashab went progressively from the bottom up of how a nefesh elokis grows in its connection to God. So there's the natural connection it has on a very childish level, basic level that is purely reflexive. There's then the more deliberate emotions as they develop, as the mind begins to inform and also recognize and inform and tame. You can even say how Binah protects its offspring, its midas. But then we get to the cognitive. There's all the levels of chetzenius hameichen and primius hameichen, which is all leading to what we just have been learning, and that is how the mind takes the person to a completely different reality. Emotions can't do that because emotions are what they are. They're wired within us. And even though there's a natural love to God, that's what it is. That's how you're wired. But the mind is a capacity to explore and to dream and to, as we discuss, imagine higher realities. Binah's role is understanding and integrating it. Chochma's role is experiencing a taste and a recognition and a resonance of that higher reality. Binah in turn informs the emotions. That's on the basic levels. But now, once you get to those higher states of consciousness, so then he introduced on page, I'm going now to page, after speaking the difference between Chochma and Binah, okay. Spoke about Gadlus, Chochma, Gadlus, Abba, Gadlus, Ima, where Binah does not have the capacity to transform the emotions. It could only bring them, it could only tame them, refine them, elevate them, and obviously allow them to expand to their fullest capacity. Chochma, because Chochma is experiencing something beyond the human being's subjectivity, emotional subjectivity, Binah relates to that emotional subjectivity. Chochma goes beyond it, so Chochma has the power to transform the midas, that you become actually a real change, a real shift. Now, once you reach that level, on page 1236 now, the paragraph that begins V'hine bichdei, now the Rebbe Rashab adds and says, in order for there to be this moichin de Gadlus in Zah, in other words, to bring this transformation back to the midas, you need something else now. You need an additional yichud, he says. Tzarich liyus yichud achar, naila b'fnei atzma. In other words, whatever we learned till now is great and great high levels, but there's one more step that's necessary. There'll be a total yichud between Chochma and Binah, what he calls zivuga shalim, a complete union. Or another word, yichud pnimi of Chochma and Binah, not just a yichud chitzeni. Because remember, Binah has not yet been elevated to the level of Chochma. Binah has been involved in taking the recognition of a higher reality of Chochma, integrating it through our understanding and comprehension, communicating that to the midas, but but the midas are not on the level of Chochma. The midas are still on the level of midas, and Binah speaking to these midas, that's the aim, revetzes ala frechim, the mother that is hovering and protecting and nurturing its young midas. But now, once those midas have been nurtured, now we come to another yichud where Chochma, where Binah is elevated back to Chochma, and that they stand the same status, same stature, as he said. That it means Chochma and Binah are on the same level. That Binah, till now, was busy with taking the awareness of Chochma into the midas. Now Binah, through the midas having been matured, they catapult the Binah back to the level of Chochma, and that's called Zivuk Shalom. Page 1237, he starts explaining what is this Zivuk Shalom. And that's where he introduces the concept that Chochma and Binah, Abba v'im mistaklim b'mitzcha the Arich. That Chochma and Binah are gazing at the forehead of Arich, and as we learned, and just to sum up, that draws this 370 energies and lights Nahirin of Atik Yemen. So even though it's not revealed in a conscious way, we don't understand it, but Chochma and Binah now are gazing, which means they're experiencing that transcendence, and that is Binah now on a deeper, higher level. That Binah, the atzmis of Binah, not as it relates, looks downward toward its young and its offspring, but the midas now have brought Binah back to Chochma, and both of them are now experiencing the supraconscious. Abba ve'ima are experiencing the supraconscious of Arich and Atik. And as you discussed at length, that there's a rotzen and there's a rotzen. Now, but we're talking here, not experiencing it in a conscious way where you actually understand it, because it's shtek kachal b'machshava, which is the whole section where he explains the two levels within that. There's the level of it being beyond Chochma and Binah, but it still has something that you can sense that there's something greater. And then there's a level which is completely beyond us, like when the 10 martyrs, Rabbi Akiva, was being tortured and barbarically killed. We have no clue. It's completely against any logic and rationale. But nevertheless, Abba Ve'im are experiencing that higher level of the divine. That's the pages 1238, 1239, and all the way through 1240 till 40. Yeah. And at 1241, let me just see one more thing, 1 second. One more point I'll make, and that when that happens, that experience also removes and eliminates and even transforms the dinim, the judgments and the severities. That was the main expression that he used from the Zohar. Just want to bring that into the picture. Let's not forget that point. The Ratzon Raivid, the Raivin, it's not Amped, called din is Tamidim Viskafin. So when you get to that level, which is like Raivid the Raivin, the third meal, the last and the highest point of Shabbos, that has the power to go and transform din. Whereas till there, Chochma and Binah do have din in them, but when you get to that level, the din is eliminated because you have what's radiating is the Ratzon and Tainug of Arich and Atik. That was explained on page 1240. Just want to see if I missed anything important. Yeah. Yeah,
which
all the way to previous Atik.
Right? This is Zivug Shlim.
Yeah, correct. The Zivug Shlim draws this down. Now, in understanding that Binah has two stages, one as it relates to its Efrechim, to its offspring and its young, and one how it returns back to the level of Chochma, what we call Zivug Shalom. So on page 1241, the Rebbe Rashab went and discusses these two levels of Binah. And here is where he introduces the inyan of the, 1 second, no, not yet. Okay, two levels of Binah, which is the two levels of Shem Sag, 63 twice is Sus, and there's two levels. One as Binah relates downward, and one as Binah elevates in the Zivug Shalom, the complete union upward. And this is where he introduces Ibur Rishon and Ibur Sheni. He brings it back now. So there's the beginning, everything began with a Ibur, where the Midas are just being born and just in a state of gestation and pregnancy, and that's a state of Katnus. That's Lamata Matam Vadas. Then went through a process of maturation, and the cognitive matures the emotions and trains, and they grow. And then we come to the Midas as they are Lamayla Matam Vadas, and that he calls Ibur Sheni. And of course, we're going to learn more about this in the paragraph that we're up to now. And that's on page 1243. And then, before we are where we are, notice the next section on page 1243 goes into the idea of B'chol Moedecha. What is B'chol Moedecha? B'chol Moedecha is the higher level. It's not B'chol Levavcha, B'chol Nafshecha. That's emotions that are al Piseichel. That's more like Binah relating to the Midas. But then when Binah in the Zivug Shalom, as it unites with Chochma, now it's experiencing the higher level of, first the level of B'chol Moedecha, and in that itself there are two levels. B'chol Moedecha, just the pure Ava Atzmis, that's higher than Seichel. And then the higher level B'chol Moedecha, where your mind, Chochma and Binah, well, Binah I should say, and Das, completely immersed, now it's Negei B'nefesh, that's where he introduces the idea that the emotions have now discovered, the mind has taught the emotions, and together they both have discovered the experience that God, you cannot live without God. So God is now the very essence of what the Nefesh Halikis is aspiring to, completely consumed by it, that the mind is thinking and contemplating and conceiving everything. So the whole human being, both the mind and the emotions, are consumed with godliness, to the point that you don't even feel it. It's a bittul, like it calls of a nekuda, not a bittul like in the lower level of B'chol Moedecha, that it's expansive, like a bligvul, like a great, powerful fire of love that's higher than B'chol Levavcha, B'chol Nafshecha. Now the opposite happens. You become so absorbed in it that you lose your whole identity in light of being so-called swallowed up and absorbed by the higher reality. Basically, Chochma and Binah are absorbed. That means they're gazing at the forehead. We're going to learn about that shortly. But that's what they mean. What does it mean, gazing? They're completely absorbed with something beyond them. And the midas have helped them get there. That's important, as we learned. And they, in turn, inform the midas. So it's really basically a dialogue and a conversation between the Chochma, the Meichen, and the midas. Both of them in their own way. The midas obviously experience it through their natural love for God, which has now been revealed. The Meichen have the capacity to internalize it in the way that we work on it. In a way, you could say the difference between midas and Meichen here is like the difference between Ben and Eved. A Ben is naturally connected to his father. So there's a very powerful thing in that because it's natural. But an Eved has the mile of Aveda. In chapter 44 in Tanya, which he referred to a few times, he says clearly that even though we have a natural love, there's something that's needed. Avas Eilam is still needed. You need still to have the effort of contemplating, because that effort makes the fire come alive much more than just the natural love. So you have both milas, that it's ingrained in us, meaning it's wired within us, this Ava Atzmis to godliness, but it's also through the Meichen that you're concentrating on it and you're focusing on it, that it also becomes through your Aveda, becomes completely internalized in all your faculties. So it's not just you're wired that way, which has its mile. It's like the difference between what Aveda accomplishes and what natural faculties accomplish. So a person can be born with being a genius naturally. But there's something called Yagaitim Etzasi. There are people through effort can sometimes reach more than someone who has a natural aptitude or natural talent. Now imagine you have both, the natural and the Yigiyah. So then you have both milas and reach the highest possible levels. And they're both necessary, which we've learned already about Ben and Eved, the Ben Shanasa Eved, Eved Shanasa Ben, that each one has its own quality. And they both inform each other. So you have here a very, as I mentioned, eloquent system where you begin from the early stages of the early young midas. They grow, they in turn come to a point where they help the mind reach higher states, to the Zivuk Shalom that we're discussing. And then both the midas and the Meichen are both absorbed with godliness, each in their own way. The Meichen, of course, focuses on the internalizing it, that we can relate to it and understand it to some extent. But remember, the point here is not so much understanding, it's more the recognition, the hakara and the hargosha, but also in seichel, not just your natural midas. So natural midas you could have, for example, a person can naturally be attracted to something that they like or repelled by something they don't like. But it's much more complete and comprehensive, which is the whole idea of Chassidus Chabad, that it doesn't just come from a spark within the soul, but that spark comes alive in all your faculties. So basically, therefore, the second level, and that's what we've been learning in the last few weeks, and that's where. So there he goes to the two levels of Chol Meidecha, which compares to the two levels in Koel Pashut, a voice, a seamless voice that does not have words, and that itself could have sound or no sound, and the no sound, of course, is a higher level. Okay. Connecting to chapter 50 in Tanya, that's important, that you move from Tzimoyin, the thirst, which is lower level of B'chol Meidecha, to Chela Sava, completely impacting the person, to B'kleis HaNefesh, complete consumption. Okay, obsession, consumption. But then comes the level of Ava B'tainugim that brings it back down in a shuv. Okay.
How could you say that the second level, which is making it Vug Shlim, that this should be his sus? Sus is mehal megovoy el anomoch, he said. That's
the Gevoy L'Nomach is the first level of Sag. Then there's Menomach L'Geveya. You go back on page.
He said sus is megovoy el anomoch.
No, he said both. Look at the bottom of page 1241, and then continuing on 1242. He said both. Sus is twice Sag. One Sag is, says a befedish. Rotz megavel enomuch, v'chein mebikol lahar. It's both mamata lamayla and mamayla lamata. It's two different levels in Binah. Yeah. Bottom of page 1241. Look. Okay. Now, So now that he finished on page 1247 is the conclusion of this topic that Binah is B'chol Moedecha, because we're not talking about Binah as understanding and comprehending and explaining it to the young Midas. That's stage one. We're talking here now about Binah being elevated and using the full capacity of its mind, because something here is negei benefesh. So like he said clearly, that the seichel, it's not just seichel alone informing the midas, it's the other way around. The avos atzmei, the very core essence of your being, is dependent on godliness. That makes the bina be completely consumed with that, to the point that it's actually comprehending things that it would never comprehend on its own. Like he said with the example, that when it's negei benefesh, you come up with ideas and innovations you would never come on your own. So now Binah has elevated to that state, and that's why Binah is called B'chol Me'edecha, which answers the question that he asked earlier about Binah and B'chol Me'edecha. Question on page 1243. Okay. And we also have the answer to the other question, is the Abba B'chol Me'edecha one that's expansive or one that's contracting, that limits, that causes the nullification of the identity? And that's again dependent on the two levels of Binah or the two levels of B'chol Me'edecha. Now, with that all that said, now the Rebbe Rashab in this paragraph that we began learning yesterday is going to come back to Ibur Sheni, which is that second level where the Midas and the Bin and the Moichin are now, the Midas are elevating Bina back to its highest state and its stature equal to Chochma, and going back also that then when you have the Zivuk Shalom, that total union, both of them, Chochma and Bina, gaze at the Metzach of Arich, which draws the energy of Atik and Pnimius Atik. So he's now going to bring all that back here in this paragraph. That's why I wanted to structure it in this fashion. So now we have at least the flow. Okay. So with that, I'll just go over what did we learn yesterday then. So he says, V'kol zeh hu inyan ibur sheni. So all this that we just discussed, where Bina is now elevated to the level of Chochma, which means that Bina is consumed with not just understanding God and informing it to so-called to its young Midas, but now there's the sense that God is, that the person cannot exist without godliness. That's why Bina is completely consumed with God in that sense, and that's called Ibur Sheni. Shezeh b'chinas Ava Pnimis, she'esa aliyah v'hagboah b'hamechin liyah b'chinas atzmis mamish. So it's the Ava Pnimis, which is now we're talking about deep level of emotion, the inner love that he spoke about just a few lines earlier, not Chitzenius Alev, but Pnimis Alev. And he says that the Ava Pnimis, like a person who's conceiving and innovating in something that's negated to his life, to his very life. And then the other way around. I'm going over, we learned this, but it's good to go over again. And through this immersion or this delving into the seichel that he's doing, also the other way around, nasa tekev ha'ava b'yesed. It causes that the ava becomes far more intense. And v'hi b'chinas ava b'chol meidecha shebepnimis atzmas nafshei b'chinas bittul b'tachlis. This is the level of the ava b'chol meidecha, the higher level. That's b'pnimis in the inner and core of the nefesh. Bittul b'tachlis, like we spoke, that bittul of the nekuda, that you completely get, what he said, the person becomes completely nullified. The words was megav the chika, because it cannot contain it. You become completely contract, as opposed to expand. And and through this causes the aliyah of bina that should be on the level of chochma, like he said at the bottom of last page, that the idea comes to a point where that it's like awareness of something that's beyond the rational itself. Okay, so Bina is not about understanding on our terms and explaining it to the midas, to its young, to its offspring. But here we're talking about that Binah is the other way around. It's facing upward and relating to something completely beyond normal comprehension. So now he's introducing back, this is the words he used back on page 1236. Yichud Pnimi, the inner union, which is Zivug Shalom, is the same thing. The inner union between Chochma and Binah. That gili that Chochma has, as we've discussed at length, how Chochma is just a nakuda, just a spark. So on one hand, it's the beginning of the process of understanding things. That's how Chochma speaks to Binah, and then Binah in turn speaks to the midas, to the emotions. But the main power of Chochma is koyach ma, as we learned, koyach ma, bittul, that it recognizes a ma, what? Something beyond. It's sensing that the idea is coming from a place that's the superconscious. Chochma is the interface. Like he says in Tanya, chapter 35 in the Agah, that the Alter Rebbe says, Shemaiti Mimeri, he heard from his teacher, Magid, that a Chochma senses hu levade ve'ein zelase. So it's not just about the beginning of wisdom, it's actually, as we spoke about, the true role of wisdom is wisdom in recognizing a reality greater than the structure of the spheres or the structure of the human being. So now Binah has been elevated to that level. That Gili Commercial B'Chacham Nimshach Gam Kein B'Binah. On the lower level, that's not the case. Binah is busy as a mother, is tending to her children, is busy training the emotions to grow. But then, as we've reached these higher levels, then Shalach to Shalach Ha'Sa'im, as he said earlier, is the aim. The Ima is going upward, returning back, the second level of Sag in Sus, back to the level that the Gili of Chochmah is Nimshach also in Binah. V'hagilihu, and this revelation, who b'chinas atzmas and shav shenimshach b'chinas Chochmah Binah. So what does this Gili, what does Chochmah have that now Binah is also, that's being drawn and transmitted into Binah? That is atzmos ein sof, not just godliness as it relates to the structure of existence, but ein sof shenimshach b'chinas Chochmah Binah. So the mind has now been able to now experience something that's beyond the rational comprehension of the structure of reality. Shezeh inyan, and that's why I wanted to go over the whole flow here. Ha'istaklus b'bchinas ponim elyenim. This is the istaklus, the gazing in the ponim elyenim, the ponim elyenim. Even ponim is like lashon rabim. Elyenim in the higher states of the ponim above, the face above. Now, of course, face here doesn't mean physical face, but just like we talk about a face physically, that the face of a human being is where where the revelation Chochmas Adam Teir Panov, that the wisdom of a person radiates, the aura on the face. So the same thing above the face here. We're talking Panim El Yenim of Arich and Atik, going back to the top of page 1237. But remember, there was also another stage where you gaze not at the forehead, you gaze at the cheeks, the Trei Tapuchin, which was a lower level, if you recall. That was a level that already associates with the hair, with the beard, that already is capable of being appreciated, that we understand, we may not know the deeper reason, but at least we know there's a reason. And then there's a higher level where we have no clue and any understanding of the godliness completely beyond intelligence. I'm talking now, I'm referring to page 1239, just to refresh your memory. She spoke about that there's two levels. There's Chochmas Timah, there's the level that is Begeder Seichel. There's Beis B'Dregs B'Chochmas Timah, Chitzenis HaChochma, which is a Mokala Chochma, so there's still some relationship between the conscious and the superconscious. And B'chinas Pnimius HaChochma, She'enei B'chinas Mokar Klal. And there's no Gili, that's Chosim V'Sosim, completely concealed, and that is Chochmas Timah Lo Da'atika. So he's now referring back to that. I'm just looking where he said the train tapuchin, which was also the Zayar. Oh, here we are. On page 1241, if you want to see where he first spoke about it. I believe that's where it was, yeah. He says, yeah, Zivug the loy shalim is when Binah is not b'shleimus, is not, its stature is not on the level of Chochma, meaning it's not the atzmis of Binah, but it's Ima Riva. That's when Binah is relating to the Midas. Ima Rivi al Bonin. It hovers over its children. And then it's not atzmis. Abba.
It's not train tapuchin, right? In that level.
No, that level is train tapuchin, I think. Yeah. He says clearly on page 1241, he says in the parentheses, the oz abavim mistakim is ponim the arich. And he explains the le'ela, it says ponim is eratzmi. Kavon al gili the train tapuchin shotikun azayin aponim mesidus. Just 1 second. Okay, there are 3 levels basically. There's a level where Abba ve'ima are not receiving the level from Chassidus. There's the level when they look at the face of Arich, but it's the cheeks. And then there's the level of the Metzach, which is the highest level of all of them. So he's saying now like this. He's joining them here together. He's not separating the 2 levels. He's just saying, is the gazing at the face of Arich, so both of them obviously are the face. Metzach is higher, but he's not distinguishing now these 2 levels. He's just saying all of it together. But Chochma and Binah are now in a level where they are united and both gazing at that face, which consists of the trentap with the cheeks and the forehead, that receive the Eira Atzmi, as we learned, the Eira Atzmi from Arich to Atik, all the way to Primius Atik. So he's a very brief here, but he's referring back to what we learned there more at length. Okay.
If it's mitzvah, it's not train tapuchin. Train tapuchin are lower than mitzvah.
Anyway, so I just answered that question. He's not going here to distinguish. You have to go earlier. Here he's talking in general, the face of Arich in general. Okay.
Also, in this level, what do you read the Chochma? If Binah is equal to Chochma, so what is the Chochma adding?
So let me continue learning, and I'll explain it as we go. Va'ayideha Aveda, the B'chol Meidecha, through the Aveda of B'chol Meidecha, Mamshichim B'chinis Meichen de Gadlus B'zah, B'chinis Gadlus Abba. So now, through the Aveda B'chol Meidecha, which we've been learning about, is what? This level of total consumption. And the mind is also completely immersed in something that's negei l'chayev mamish, negei b'nafshe, negei to its very existence. So this, the Aveda B'chol Meidecha, you're drawing now from the Meichen de Gadlus, from this mature level and state of intellect and cognitive, B'zah, b'chinas Gadlus Abba. The Gadlus Abba, not just Gadlus Ima, but Gadlus Abba, which I'm going to explain. Well, it's really understood already from what we learned before, but let's just continue. You'll see how it goes here. So you're drawing now Gadlus Abba. Till now, the Midas had only a relationship with Binah, because Binah was their mother that took care of them and trained them, and through the comprehension of Binah, because Chochma is detached from emotions, because it's just an akuda. You can't train someone with just a spark and a kernel of a higher awareness. It has to be developed like in a river, comprehensively in Binah. That in turn informs and trains the Midas. So the Midas had a relationship with Binah. Now we're learning that the Midas have catapulted Binah to the level that it should stand side by side back with the father, Abba ve'ima together, both gazing and experiencing a higher reality. So what's the relationship now with Chochma? Now that Binah is side by side with Chochma, now you can have the Gadlus Abba as well, not just Gadlus Binah, but Gadlus Abba as well, that should radiate in the Midas. The Midas of Zohar Ampin, which is a lower level, it's not Arich Ampin. Zohar Ampin began as called the small face. Arich Ampin is called the long face, the large face. Because the small face is very mitzumtzum, it's limited, relatively speaking, obviously. So that the Zohar should radiate within them the Gadlus HaMeichin of Abba, Meichin the Gadlus of Abba, Meichin the Gadlus, Meichin the Gadlus, I'm sorry, Meichin the Gadlus HaMeichin the Abba, the mature intellect of Abba of Chochma. Like it says in the Siddur, this is the Siddur that the Mittler Rebbe published and composed, which is the Maimonim of the Alter Rebbe, structured around the davening of in the Siddur. The Ian Hashemayim Mesaprim. So there, when he talks about Hashemayim Mesaprim Kvoit Keil, that the heavens relate on the glory of God, that is called the Gilib Chines Meichin, the Kodesh, which is always Chochma. Kodesh is Chochma. Kadesh Mila Begarmei. So that's where it explains the idea when that level is revealed in the Siddur. And what does it mean? For who? That the inner intention that's in the mind should also be revealed in the heart. Now, there's going to be more discussion on this. Let me just stop here and explain what this means. So, let's go back to what I said before. The role of Chochma is to have within the conscious structure of the human being, or we could say the conscious structure of the 10 spheres from which evolves the human being and our faculties, like he says in Tanya, that the 10 faculties, human faculties evolve, nishtalshel mehen, from the 10 spheres. So Chochma, being the first sphere, is the interface between beyond structure and structure, the interface between superconscious and conscious. And how does it manifest, therefore? In a nakuda. It's a drop. On one hand, the drop now has some substance. On the other hand, it doesn't have any width or breadth or length, like we discussed. It's just a concentrated point. So the part of the structure, it means that you have at least an idea has entered into your mind, which can then be developed by Binah. But it's still only a spark of an idea, and it could easily disappear as well. Koyach ma. It's a koyach, it's a faculty, but it's a bittul dika type of faculty. So the Nekuda Chochma, as soon as a person has that spark, it's coming from where? You can't really identify where it came from, but you know it came from somewhere. So in the levels of Aveda, it's the level of bittul that intelligence experiences a recognition of a higher reality. But in Chochma, it's not developed at all. You can't live with that. You can't live in Chochma. Chochma has to be now fleshed out and developed. But then you have the problem the other way around. As soon as you develop it, it loses that so-called that spark of clarity that Chochma has. So the real goal is to develop it, but also maintain the integrity, which is why, as we learned both earlier here and in the previous volume, that you always need Chacham bebina. Just as you need Bina b'Chochma, you need Chacham to keep Bina honest and so-called make sure that there's a reality check. That when you start developing something, it's easy to wander off the reservation and get away from the original point. So you constantly need Chochma as so-called watching over that Bina should be on track. Bina's my goal is to develop it that you can relate to it. And also could be taught then to the next level to its students. And who are the students here or the children? These are the midas. Because midas, as we know, are subjective in nature. That's how we're wired. The midas left a human being without mind and only emotions will simply follow its impulses. Despite the fact, yes, that deeply embedded inside the neshama is a natural love for God, but it would not emerge on its own. So the midas now would just follow its impulses, even if it's divine impulses, but it's still on a very childish level. It would be like the Kabbalah sale of a 2-year-old saying Moeda'ani or davening. It's there, but you can't say that the child is completely internalized it. It's just there as a natural reflex or a natural emotion that you just say it. Like the person who, like the Yerushalmi says, someone went into, they were saying Moedim, he automatically bowed down. Menafshe kara, because he was so, it's part of his habit. So on one hand, it's beautiful. That's the natural habit of a soul to bow down when you say Moedim. But on the other hand, it's without Aveda. That's just how you are. Binah is the growth of a human being requires, that's why I say, V'yadaita hayayim v'hashavesa levavecha, as we've been learning that operative posuk that's so relevant to this whole discussion. Why do you need the da? Why do you need vidaita hayayim? Because it's not enough just to have natural emotion. That's not why the neshama came down to earth, to just express its natural state. It's to work on it. It's to develop it in a way that completely consumes you. Remember, this is going to be critical because once you encounter the nefesh habamis, then you're going to have two forces here: the natural love to God that the nefesh l'kis has, but the natural inclination of the animal soul, which is quite powerful, to material desires, like he explains in Tanya. So that is one reason that you must have a contemplation. But even without the nefesh habamis, as he explains in chapter 44 in Tanya, the contemplation brings to life that pilot flame is natural to the person, but Binah brings it to life because you're contemplating on it and you're busy thinking about it. So that brings to life that pilot flame of Chochma in Binah. Binah in turn now can inform and educate the emotions and say, explain it, so to speak, to the emotions, train them, refine them to desire and to be drawn to more sublime things than just material or even behavioral or childish type of experiences. We're not even talking about animal soul now. We're talking about even on divine level, but it's still in an immature level. So that's the role of Binah. Midas, the role of Midas is the actual experience, because Chochma and Binah at the end of the day are instructors. They're the parents. The real place where it plays itself out, they're like the captains of the ship. You could say Chochma is the captain of the ship. Binah is the second in command that takes the orders of Chochma and develops them and fleshes them out, and then in turn instructs the rest of the crew to bring it down into a real experience that the ship should move. A captain without a ship is like a Chochma or Binah or Moichin without Midas. A ship without a captain is like a ship with a ship without a captain is like Midas without Moichin, or Midas without Moichin is like a ship without a captain. So where does it play itself out? In Vashavesa Levavecha. But they both need, you need everything here. Now, Binah, even when it's on the same level of Chochma, you just asked that question, it's not Chochma. It never says here that Binah becomes Chochma. It says that Binah, whose role is to express and comprehend and express and train and develop the idea, is on the same level of Chochma, meaning it's experiencing the divine truth of Chochma. So the ultimate goal is that Chochma comes into Binah. Chochma is the interface from the superconscious to the conscious. The conscious now is developed and internalized through Binah. Binah in turn trains and educates the Midas, so it becomes our actual experience. And now begins the process the other way around, that the Midas have grown. They in turn catapult Binah back to Chochma. So Binah is now experiencing, together with Chochma, father and mother are gazing at a higher reality. If you want to put it in more physical terms, which I don't like to do, but I'll just say it, that when a father and mother conceive a child, and now you need to take care of the child. You can't just have the father and mother just be alone and intimate all the time, because you need the mother to take care of the children. But then when the children grow up, so the mother and father, in a sense, can return to their so-called intimate state. They're gazing at Arich and Atik, and they can experience. Now, I don't mean this in the physical terms that a mother cannot experience the divine. Mothering children is considered the most divine thing of all. But we're talking about on the level of Giluyim, where the mother can return to that same stature with Abba Ve'ima together and experience a totally super conscious state. But remember, the children are now also part of it because they've grown up. So the emotions are developed emotions, and that's why he says, so this Aveda B'chol Me'idecha, where Binah trained the emotions in turn catapulted Binah to the level of B'chol Me'idecha. Because we learned before, Binah and B'chol Me'idecha is the same level, a blikvul level, but a total consumption, totally consumed by godliness. That in turn causes Binah to be side by side with Chochma, experiencing the divine. As Chochma senses that higher reality, and now because Binah is involved, and Binah is so-called the interface between Chochma and the Midas, so that now translates that the Gadlus Abba is now being transmitted into Meir ben B'chinas Gadlus Mechin the Abba, also in the Midas. So the Midas now, which initially only had mainly a relationship with Binah, are also experiencing emotionally the resonance and the recognition and the clarity that Chochma, the Riyah, the sight of the vision of Chochma has. And what he says in one line here is, and that means let me explain that with an example. The example we've been using. When you build a house, let's take that. There's a bunch of factors involved. There's obviously the factor that you want to have the home. We learned about that much earlier. Well, not that much earlier, but we learned earlier that you need a rotzen. Every person has a rotzen. Ein adam b'loy bias. We have a rotzen atzmi. We have a fundamental core desire to have a home. That's how we're wired. Chassidus explains that because the Eibishter is the Sava Kodesh Baruch Hu Liyas Leis Baruch Dira B'Tachtenim, in the etzem of Atzmus, his desires Adira, that in turn was transmitted into a human being, that we have a fundamental desire to have a home and not live in the street, to have our own dwelling place where we can be comfortable. Okay, but Ratzon enough is not, Ratzon alone doesn't build homes. We're not talking about Lamaila. Even Lamaila, the Eibishter says, okay, that Ratzon, if you remember all the different stages, ultimately has to be translated into a plan. What's the plan? A blueprint that says, what kind of home do you want? So you need Chochma, which is the kernel that takes Ratzon, which is, by the way, Arich, not by the way, it's relevant to this discussion. It takes the Ratzon of Arich and turns it into a spark of an idea. That idea alone is not enough to build a home. You need to flesh it out. So Binah fleshes out the kernel of Chochma, which originated from Ratzon, the Ratzon for the home. Okay? And then you actually start building. You actually have the home. Now, the people who are building the home, what do they know about the bigger plan? They know what they're told. Here's the blueprint, follow the blueprint, lay the bricks, build these in these rooms with these and these materials. This is the size, these are the materials. So the workers who are working on it and actually building the home are not necessarily very privy to the deeper kavanah and intention, what this home is for and why is it being built and how it will be used. Because their job is building. So in that sense, if you think, let's talk about it Lamaila, God desired to have create existence. How does he create existence? He turns it into a Chochma, which is a kernel, which fleshed out in Binah, developed details. So when we look in Chumash, we learned this last week's parsha. And says in some places, Bereshis b'chuchmasa. That's Chochma. We learned this as well, which is driven by the Ratzon. If there's no Ratzon, there's no Chochma. That in turn translates in Chochma. It has to be developed into details. Yem echad vayemer elikim yehi or yehi or. Vayemer elikim yehi rakia. Teitzer is desha. All the 6 days is fleshing out the details that all began with the Nakuda of Chochma. So now, when we live in this world, in this existence, and we look around, what do we know about God's deeper intentions? So on our own, we can only figure out certain things. Even a human being, a scientist, can only figure out as much as the mind can figure. But the Torah, God wants to reveal to us what his deeper intention is in creation. That's why he gave us a Torah, which is Chochma shel Yisbarach, Chochma Yisbarach, Chochma shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu, which in turn is also Ritzeinei shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's what it says, Torah, mitzvahs, Chochma is Ritzeinei. What is his Chochma? What is the Nekuda behind it all? What's the Nekuda Pnimius within all existence? Is to make a Dira B'Tachteinim, is to make V'asili Migdash, V'Shachanti B'Secha. Or all the mitzvahs in the Torah is revealing God's desire as it manifests in Chochma, that's Torah is Chochma, to know what's the Pnimius HaKavanah. If we didn't have Torah, we'd have a world, and yes, intelligence, and humans would try their best to figure out, but how much would we figure out already? Even with the Torah, look how challenging it is. So we have here all these levels. The goal, however, is God doesn't just want us to follow his orders. He also wants us to experience and understand his deepest kavanah. He wants us to not just relate to the level of midas, which is experience and implementation that leads to behavioral implementation and emotional experience. He wants the emotions to also relate to the experience, to relate to the higher levels, not just of Binah, but also of Chochma, which is the Nekuda, the point in which lies the entire purpose of creation, and even to Ratzon itself. He wants us to connect to the Ratzon. So that example helps us understand what's going on here. But that has to come after a lot of Aveda. You can't begin. You can't teach a 2-year-old or even a 5-year-old the deepest levels of godliness. The first thing is we have to teach the child how to follow what the Torah says, behaviorally, and then you train and you grow. That's called chinuch, education, training, refining, taming, evolving, growing, developing. But when you talk on the highest levels, you finally come to a point where the midas themselves lead Binah back to its original place. Binah in turn now is together side by side with Chochma, and that, b'chol meidecha, of Binah is drawing the Gadlus Abba, not just Gadlus Ima, the Gadlus Abba, that till now is really much more off limits, is now become part of the experience, is being drawn into it. Then what does that mean? As he says in one line, he says that means that in the Midas is also experiencing, I just want to read the line again. So usually the lev is only privy to the so-called external elements of the meich. The lev is an emotional expression. When you, for example, love someone, all the intelligence and all the power and intensity behind it is not necessarily revealed in the emotion. The emotion is very passionate and it implements it, and the bottom line is to actually have a feeling toward the thing you love. But all the reasoning that led to that is more or less beyond, remains concealed, as we learned earlier. That when the midas don't experience Pnimius HaMeich, but in this level of God of Zivug Shalom, this higher level of B'chol Meidecha, now not just that Binah and Chochma join, but also the midas are experiencing that higher sense of reality, recognition, a vision, resonance of Chochma and Gadlus Abba. And I think the example I gave helps make sense a bit of this line. But I'll stop here if anybody wants to ask anything. I hope that helped clarify this section here with the example that I gave. So you have all these levels of Arich, and behind Arich is of course Tainug of Atik, the Ratzon, Tainug Ratzon, Chochma, Binah, Midas. That's the structure and how they work with each other as they grow and ultimately join together. But I see in the Yesh Lamer, he's going to explain going to further explain this idea. But being the time, I'm going to stop here. Again, any questions? I'll be happy to take questions, and we'll continue tomorrow from the Yesh Lamer, Yesh Lamer. I think it's a good place to stop.
The Midas experience the barrage of Chochma and Binah, but they don't go up to the level of Chochma and Binah itself, do they?
I'm only reading what it says here. So far, he's not said that explicitly, even though he did say earlier that Zoh Atika Ochid Vitalia, if you remember, that Zoh, Midas, are rooted in Atik, but they're not in a revealed way at all. But it seems to me that it's going to reveal the Shiur, the root of the Midas in Atik. Because remember, the Midas have the advantage that is the natural Atzmis Dikalov. However, they don't have, without the Moichin, it doesn't come to life and it's not revealed. So I would say, even though he didn't say it explicitly, that the Midas will be restored, so to speak, or their source will be revealed in them through this. But he didn't say it yet. He may say it a little later. I think he's going to say something like that. But that already comes down to the extent. Does anyone remember where the Zoh Achid Talia Batika was said earlier? What page that was on? You understand what I just said, Tzvi?
A little bit.
Little, okay. Anybody remembers where that line Zoh is rooted higher? Okay, I'll look for it. Anyone else? Any question? Any other questions?
Yes. You said that the Zohar is rooted in, is it Panemius Atik?
He said Batika, only Atik. I'm not sure about Pnimi. I'm looking for it right now. I'm trying to find it.
So what would Seichel be rooted in? Did he say?
Yeah, it's lower than Midas, but Seichel has the advantage that in Giluyim it's higher. So it's like anything. Like Kalim are rooted higher than Ur, but Ur is far more revealed divine, and it reveals the root of Kalim in the Kalim. This is a common theme in Chassidus, that the lower level is rooted higher, but to get there, you need to have that level that's in between. So in root, the Midas can be rooted higher than Chochma, the Moichin, but in actuality, you need the Moichin to reveal that in the Midas. I'm just looking where this was said. I don't see it right now. I thought it was the B'chol Moedecha. So much material here. It's hard to find things. Okay. I'll look around some more.
So does that mean that the ultimate highest yichud of a human being with God is an emotional one, since the midas are rooted in a higher level than an intellectual one?
No, it's very clear not, because emotions are ultimately an experience. Mind can actually imagine and relate to a superconscious state. Midas on their own are just a behavior. At the end of the day, they're an experience, like a ship without a captain. You need both. The moichin leads you to these higher states,
right?
And you need everything. It's not a black and white thing. It's each plays its role. It's like asking a question. Why do you need Atzilus, Bri, Yitzir, and Asiya? We need everything here. We need Atik and Arich, like I explained in building a home. You must have Chochma and Binah, because they're the interface, and they create objectivity, and they lead the Midas to a higher place. Ultimately, yes, Moichin without Midas is just in the mind. But Midas without Moichin are also not enough. And you need everything for it to be, like I said before, Ben and Eved. You need the Avodah, and you need the natural connection. And each has something the other one doesn't have. And they all complement each other. If you want to speak about the Mila of Midas, we can talk about that. But then there's a Mila and Moichin. Each thing has its role.
But this level...
The Rebbe speaks very often, for example, that in the Maimorim of Pesach, it talks about that Pesach is the greatest. In the Maimorim of Shavuos, that Shavuos is the greatest. And the Maimorim of Sukkot, that Sukkot is the greatest. So the Rebbe said, which one is it? And the Rebbe answers that each one in their time is the shar, the gate, that connects us to everything else. Because each one has a quality the other doesn't have. And through that quality, you come to appreciate the others, and everything flows through that. So when you're doing a mitzvah, all the mitzvahs are within that mitzvah, except right now the focus is on tefillin or on Shabbos or something like that. So the same thing here. Each one has their quality that they contribute to the entire picture.
But when you gave your beautiful explanation of like how Chochma and Binah and Zohar and the Binah with the hovering over its chicks, and everything. Then Chochma and Binah can bring them all, elevate them all when they become mature by looking at the Tepuchim and then the Metzach, and then everybody's going up to this highest level of Panemius or to Arich or whatever that ultimate level. But when they get there, everybody's there. So as you said, everybody has a role when they get there. But is it like that the children, the midos, being the children, ultimately connecting with their shorish, which is the highest level? It's like the parents bringing the child to the, to the Shem, and then that's the deepest yichud or hiskashus that could be done. Or you're saying no, when they're all up there at that highest level, everybody's come along for the ride, so to speak. Amazing journey. When they get there, you wouldn't speak of different levels there. That those because the shorish is ultimately higher for the midas, for the children, for the banim. You wouldn't say that they ultimately would have the deepest connection. Everybody up at that level, Binah and Chochma, Seichels and midas, would all have the same level of ultimate connection with Yichud.
So I would say the following. I'll answer that question with in a different context, but I think it'll make it clear. There's a pasuk that says that Mashiach comes in the future, in Lasad Lavei, v'lo yalamdu oid isha sre'eyu, that one person will no longer teach another, his friend, ki kulam yedu esi, because all will know me, esi, me, atzmus, miktanam at gdelam, from young to old. So the question is asked, if no one will teach another and they'll all know me, so why will there be Katan and Gadol? Why you say Miktanim ad Gadol? Will they lose their status as Katan and Gadol? No. The answer is there's only one Atzmus. God is one. But God chose to create a multifarious, a structured existence that consists of infinite amount of details. Each detail carries another piece of the DNA, if you wish, of godliness. So when you have, each piece has its own godly element to it, godly feature, if you wish. Chochma has its, Binah is, Midas. And the same thing, each human being for that matter. A Gadol and a Katan, a Kohen, a Levi, Yisrael, a Talmid Chacham, and even a simple person, everybody. Like we said in Parshat Nitzavim. The leaders to the water carriers. When they all come together, like we say, a Kema Shlema, one entire structure, they each complement each other, and together they reveal to us not just that piece of DNA within them, but a much bigger picture of godliness. Now, Atzmus is always going to be beyond. But God wanted that we should discover Atzmus within the details of existence. So in the ultimate picture, when they all come together, we would say they don't become Atzmus because there's only one God, but they all recognize the highest states of Atzmus, each in their own way, while also, in a sense, also eliminating that one depends on the other like a child would depend on a parent. But there's still going to be two different states. So it's really a combination of structure and beyond structure at once. Now we have structure, and we're trying to take all the details of the structure and connect it to Hashem Echad. Once we do, we don't say the existence will cease to exist. The world, there'll still be tachtenim. However, it won't be tachten as in concealing godliness. In each detail, the trees, daimim, tsemeach, chaim, medaber, every human being will still be existent. We all will not become one identity. We're not going to be annihilated. Our individuality won't be annihilated. That's why it's Miktanim Vagdelim. But each individual will be completely connected to the Etzem, and they all need each other, and each will complement each other. So the mile that Midas has will definitely shine, and it will feed Moichin. But at the same time, he says here that Moichin also feeds and causes the Avid to get greater. So think of it this way. Let's say you have a very passionate love to God, but your mind is now involved because it's negei b'nefesh. The mind is also involved because it's mamish negei to your very existence, And when the mind gets more involved, it causes the fires of the passion to become even stronger, intense, as he said here, b'chol meidecha. And you have both. And remember, the pasuk v'yadaita ayim v'ashal v'esel levavecha is a pasuk nitzchi. It's an internal verse that will be also l'asad lave. But then knowledge will not be there to teach midas. Knowledge will be there to help the midas grow to higher states of awareness and consciousness, which is the role of meichin. And midas will be there to experience that higher state of consciousness. So you need the awareness and the experience, and they feed each other constantly in an ongoing process that has no end. This will never come to a conclusion because it's all Ein Sof. But the difference is that L'asad Loveh now it's still in a concealed way, and very much structure is so significant. And L'asad Loveh will have that connection and then just be connecting on deeper and deeper levels. That's how I would explain it.
Beautiful explanation, but but when it says everybody will know me, but you won't learn from each other, what's the actual? You won't learn from each other.
No longer will one teach another. In other words, the idea of me teaching an ignorant person who doesn't know,
right?
No, that person will also have their connection, but that doesn't mean there don't be diversity.
But in a sense where you said that the seichel will add to the midas, and the midas will have experience of God, and the seichel will understand it, and so they'll interact with each other, so to speak. Isn't that interacting a level of learning from each other?
Well, learning means here as if you need me, because without me you can't experience it. We're not talking there. It's more, I would call it more growth. You want to call it learning, but it's not so much about learning. Like today, without Torah, you don't know. You simply don't know. The midas would not know what to do if seichel didn't guide it.
Mm-hmm.
Look at a human being. Then midas will follow what God wants. It doesn't need the seichel, for example, not to tell it to go here and not here. But it needs seichel to appreciate deeper levels of the divine and awareness level.
So we'll still benefit.
Ultimately, the goal is dira b'tachtenim. You want etzem, but in a way that's we can fully experience it. And to do that, you must have meichin and midas. That's the point.
Right. But there will be an interaction, and there will be benefit from each other. From Zev and Zev will benefit from each other.
Yeah, because then you say also Mashiach will teach. So how does that stem with the pasuk? Mashiach will teach everyone.
Right.
Because there's still going to be levels of growth.
Mm-hmm.
The pasuk is coming to explain that you don't need to have so-called, as I said, a teacher to let you know the facts. You'll need a teacher more to help you grow, more type of thing. Maybe it wouldn't be called a teacher.
But what you just mentioned about Mashiach, isn't that like an earlier part of the progression than we were talking about?
Mashiach is the highest ultimate level. Here he's not necessarily talking at the level of Geula. Maybe he will be talking about it, I'm not sure. But it's probably going to lead to it ultimately. What we've been learning is not so much about, is more the stages of growth. And ultimately, there's no question that Zivuk Shalom of Chochma, Binah, and Midas on this level, L'asad level will be the ultimate. But he hasn't said that explicitly yet.
Gotcha. And I'm really excited about learning about Gan Eden, because Gan Eden, the Chochma and Binah were merged together, like male and female were one, and we're going to get to that plus some more that they weren't able to do. It's so exciting.
We're around 6 pages away to get back to Gan Eden.
I don't know about you guys, but I thought we were in Gan Eden this morning.
Yeah, that's a good point. But we're talking about in the text, not in the experience.
I understand. It's just...
No, the midas, you're right, but the moichin is not there yet.
Eliezer, that's a good one.
And you asked a very good question earlier. Shkoyach.
Yeah. Look, it's almost like combining, since we're coming from Simchas Torah. So someone will say, once you reach Simchas Torah, why do we go back to learning Aleph Beis and Chitas and learning every day Torah, Gemara, Chassidus? Simchas Torah, we reach the Etzem. We dance with the Torah as it's higher than Seichel. And yet we go back to the world of Seichel. Because you want to bring that Etzem into the Chochma. And you want the Chochma to appreciate. You can imagine a person who learns Torah all year, when they dance Simchas Torah, and their blikvul is going to be different than the blikvul of a person who hasn't learned. Even though there's something that equalizes everyone, but still, even in the equal, there's a different appreciation when you know what we're talking about. I mean, I remember when the Rebbe danced Simchas Torah, so we all danced. But a Rebbe dancing Simchas Torah is with the whole Torah that he has all year round, and he's dancing. That would be a perfect example. So you need to have constant balance between these atzmisdik experiences that are beyond everything, but then bring it back into structure. And the structure should experience beyond structure. It's a constant dance back and forth. And they inform each other. That's ultimately dir b'tachtenim, my friends. You know, if Atzmus didn't want all this, he could have just been very comfortable alone, without structures, without anything. And all this whole complexity wouldn't be needed. But clearly that's the kavanah. Now, it's nesava, it's a desire, but that's how it is. So I think this is what really, when you think of tachtenim, that's what tachtenim means. First of all, it's loshen rabim, it's plural, and it means the details, the nano details of every fiber of existence ultimately, and each of them all coming together in this great dance. So I think if you think of a symphony where you have 8 billion players and instruments all playing one symphony, would be a good example of the diversity and the harmony all in one. And Eliezer, you'll be at the main piano.
Thank you. Wow, that would be amazing. I was just, but you got me going thinking that, why did we have to leave Simchas Torah at the highest? We're at the pinnacle beyond knowledge. Maybe, Svi, anybody of you guys want to join me next Simchas Torah, and we'll go for the Guinness Book of World Records for the longest hakafa in the world. We'll continue dancing from Simchas Torah, see how long we can go. Maybe we can make it all the way to Hanukkah, just without stopping, just dancing around.
I'm at a low level. I was just like the longest
just
cheer in the
dancing,
world.
Why do we have to come back? We're at the pinnacle. Stay at the pinnacle.
1 second, Eliezer, there are many guests that usually stay till Hanukkah and some till Pesach even. So
yes, we could maybe incorporate them. Can you imagine that?
I'm just going to stop the recording. 1 second. Hold on before you continue. So we're stopping here, middle of page 1248.